The woman was hired to clean the millionaire's house, until one day he asked her to help him take a shower. The millionaire's vulnerability made her see the man behind the mask of power and wealth. What happened during this simple act of help will leave you shocked. Follow this beautiful story and many others on our channel. The faint sound of Martha Wheeler's sturdy cleaning shoes echoed through the marble hallway of Westbrook Estate. She adjusted her simple grey uniform and took a deep breath before entering the grand kitchen, where the morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured gardens of Greenwich, Connecticut. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," Martha greeted the housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s who had been managing the estate for over 2 decades. "Martha, thank God you're here. We need all hands on deck today," Mrs. Peterson replied, not looking up from her clipboard. "Mr. Blackwood has requested a thorough cleaning of the East Wing. It's been closed for years, but apparently he's decided to open it again." Martha nodded, though her heart sank a little. In the 3 months she'd been working at Westbrook Estate, she'd never once encountered its owner, Ethan Blackwood. The billionaire tech entrepreneur was something of a ghost, a name whispered among the staff with equal parts reverence and fear. His reputation preceded him, cold, demanding, and intensely private. "Has something changed?" Martha asked, tying her auburn hair back into a practical ponytail. Mrs. Peterson's expression softened slightly. "He's coming home tomorrow. Usually he only stays for a day or two, but this time he's planning to remain indefinitely." This news rippled through Martha like an electric current. Working at Westbrook had been a blessing. The pay was generous, and it allowed her to send money back to her sister in Ohio, who was raising Martha's nephew alone after her brother-in-law abandoned them. But the thought of working under the direct scrutiny of the infamous Ethan Blackwood made her nervous. The East Wing was like stepping into another world. While the rest of the mansion maintained a modern, minimalist aesthetic, this wing seemed frozen in time, warm, traditional, and filled with personal touches. Dusty photographs in silver frames lined the walls, showing a younger, smiling Ethan beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile. "That's Mrs. Blackwood," whispered Rosa, another housekeeper who had worked at the estate longer than Martha. "She passed away 5 years ago. Mr. Blackwood closed this wing the day after and hasn't set foot in it since." Martha carefully picked up one of the frames, wiping away years of dust to reveal the couple on what appeared to be a sailing trip, their faces glowing with happiness. "What was her name?" "Olivia," Rosa replied softly. "They were college sweethearts. She was the only person who could make him laugh, according to the older staff. After she was gone, he changed completely." As Martha continued cleaning, she pieced together fragments of Ethan Blackwood's life from the belongings she encountered. Shelves filled with books on philosophy and art, many with handwritten notes in the margins. A collection of vinyl records, ranging from classical to jazz, a half-finished painting on an easel covered with a sheet. This wing told the story of a different man than the cold-hearted tycoon described in business magazines and gossip columns. 3 days later, Westbrook Estate buzzed with nervous energy. Mr. Blackwood had arrived late the previous night, and Martha had yet to see him. As she went about her morning duties cleaning the main library, she heard the door open behind her. "You missed a spot." The deep voice made Martha jump. She spun around to find herself face to face with Ethan Blackwood himself, tall and imposing in an impeccably tailored suit. He looked exactly like his photographs except for one stark difference. He appeared exhausted, with dark circles under his piercing blue eyes and a pallor to his skin that spoke of someone unwell. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood," Martha stammered, immediately returning to dust the shelf he had indicated. He remained in the doorway, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You're new?" "Yes, sir, Martha Wheeler. I started 3 months ago." He nodded curtly. "You cleaned the East Wing." It wasn't a question, but Martha felt compelled to respond. "Yes, sir, we all did." "Did you move anything?" "No, sir. Mrs. Peterson was very clear that everything should remain exactly as it was." Something flickered across his face. Relief, perhaps, or disappointment. Martha couldn't tell. Without another word, he turned to leave, but as he did, he swayed slightly, reaching out to steady himself against the doorframe. Martha instinctively stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, are you all right?" He straightened immediately, his expression hardening. "I'm fine. Finish your work." But he wasn't fine. As the days passed, Martha observed him from a distance, noting how he would grip railings for support when climbing stairs, how his hands would tremble slightly when reaching for objects, how he would sometimes pause mid-sentence during phone calls as if trying to catch his breath. One evening, as Martha was finishing her shift, she passed by the study and heard a crash. Without thinking, she rushed in to find Ethan Blackwood on the floor, a broken whiskey glass beside him. "Mr. Blackwood," she gasped, kneeling beside him. Up close, the signs of his deterioration were even more apparent. The weight loss, the shallow breathing, the perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the room. "Get out," he growled, attempting to stand but failing. "Sir, you need help. Let me call a doctor." "No doctors," he snapped. "No one can know about this. Help me to my room, then leave. That's an order." Against her better judgment, Martha complied, allowing him to lean on her as they slowly made their way to the master bedroom. Once there, he collapsed onto the bed, his breathing labored. "Should I get Mrs. Peterson?" Martha asked, hovering uncertainly by the door. "No," he replied, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "No one can know. I can't appear weak. Not now." Martha hesitated, torn between respecting his wishes and her concern for his well-being. "Sir, I don't mean to overstep, but you clearly need medical attention." He closed his eyes. "It's nothing. They can fix. I've seen the best specialists in the country. I know exactly what's wrong with me, and I've made my peace with it." The implication of his words hung heavy in the air. Martha felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized what he was saying. This powerful man, who commanded an empire from behind these walls, was seriously ill. "I'll be fine by morning," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Just need to rest." Martha nodded, backing toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Blackwood." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Martha?" "Yes, sir?" "Thank you," he said, the words sounding foreign on his lips, as if he wasn't accustomed to expressing gratitude. "And remember, not a word of this to anyone." She nodded again, closing the door behind her. As she walked down the grand staircase, Martha found herself contemplating the enigma of Ethan Blackwood. The titans of industry were supposed to be invincible, yet behind closed doors, he was fighting a battle he couldn't win with all his billions. The next morning, Martha arrived at work to find Mrs. Peterson waiting for her. "Mr. Blackwood has requested that you be reassigned as his personal assistant," the housekeeper announced, clearly baffled by this development. "Me? But I have no experience as—" "Those were his specific instructions. You'll be reporting directly to him from now on. Your duties will include managing his schedule, correspondence, and—" Mrs. Peterson hesitated, attending to his personal needs. Martha felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now why he had chosen her. She was the only one who knew about his condition. She had seen behind the curtain, glimpsed the vulnerability he so desperately wanted to hide from the world. As she ascended the staircase toward his suite, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold, stepping into a complicated situation that would test the boundaries between employer and employee, between duty and compassion, between professional distance and human connection. Little did she know that behind the imposing doors of Ethan Blackwood's private chambers lay not just a man battling illness, but a soul haunted by secrets and regrets that would soon entangle her in ways she never could have imagined. Martha's first week as Ethan Blackwood's personal assistant was a masterclass in contradiction. The man who dominated boardrooms and commanded respect across Silicon Valley could barely rise from his bed some mornings. His condition seemed to fluctuate. There were days when his strength returned enough for him to conduct video conferences from his study, and others when he couldn't even hold a pen steady. On a particularly difficult Thursday morning, Martha arrived at his suite with his usual breakfast tray to find him attempting to button his shirt, his fingers trembling too, much to complete the simple task. "Let me help you," she said quietly, setting down the tray. Pride flashed in his eyes. "I don't need—" "Mr. Blackwood," Martha interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "We both know that's not true." A tense silence followed, broken only when he dropped his hands in surrender. Martha approached cautiously and began fastening the buttons, acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment. His skin was warm beneath the fine cotton, and this close she could smell his expensive cologne mingled with something else, a medicinal scent she recognized from her grandmother's final days. "Why haven't you told the staff?" she asked, keeping her eyes fixed on her task. "Because pity is more debilitating than any illness," he replied. "The moment people know, everything changes. The way they look at you, speak to you, treat you. I refuse to be defined by this temporary setback." Martha glanced up at him, noting the stubborn set of his jaw. "Is it temporary?" Something flickered in his gaze, a momentary vulnerability before the walls came back up. "Everything is temporary, Miss Wheeler. Success, failure, health, life itself." As the days passed, Martha found herself becoming more than just an assistant. She was his shield against the outside world, maintaining the illusion of his undiminished power. She learned to forge his signature on documents when his hands wouldn't cooperate, to speak on his behalf during phone calls when his voice failed him, to anticipate his needs before he had to voice them. One evening, after a particularly challenging day of back-to-back virtual meetings, Ethan collapsed in his private study, his breathing shallow and labored. "I'm calling a doctor," Martha insisted, reaching for her phone. "No," he gasped, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "Just help me to the bathroom. I need to take my medication." She supported him as they made their way to his lavish ensuite bathroom, where he fumbled with a prescription bottle before dropping it, pills scattering across the marble floor. "Damn it," he hissed, his frustration palpable. Martha calmly retrieved the pills, counting out the correct dosage and handing it to him with a glass of water. He swallowed them with difficulty, then leaned heavily against the sink. "I need to shower," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Can't stand the smell of sickness on me." Martha hesitated. "I'll call for Jenkins." The butler had been with the family for decades and would normally assist with such matters. "No," Ethan's voice was firm. "No one else can see me like this. I'd rather go without." Martha studied his pale face, the determination in his eyes despite his weakened state. She made a decision that she knew crossed a line. "I'll help you." Surprise registered on his face. "That's not part of your job description, Ms. Wheeler." "Neither. Was becoming your ghostwriter or voice double, but here we are," she replied with a small smile. "Let me help, or you'll likely fall and crack your head open on this ridiculously expensive marble." A faint smile tugged at his lips, the first she'd seen. "You're unusually direct for someone on my payroll." "My grandmother always said honesty was cheaper than Band-Aids." Martha turned to start the shower. "Besides, I grew up helping my grandfather after his stroke. This isn't new territory for me." What followed was an exercise in professional detachment, as Martha helped Ethan undress and steady himself in the shower. She kept her eyes averted as much as possible, focusing on the practical aspects of the task while he maintained a stoic silence. But the vulnerability of the moment was impossible to ignore. This man who commanded an empire worth billions, reduced to needing help with the most basic human functions. As she helped him into fresh pajamas afterward, he finally spoke. "This was not how I envisioned spending my 40s, being bathed like an infant." "Well, on the bright side, you have much nicer towels than an infant," Martha replied, trying to lighten the mood as she buttoned his silk pajama top. He let out a short, surprised laugh, then winced as if the sound hurt him. "You're an unusual woman, Martha Wheeler." "I prefer the term adaptable," she countered, helping him to his bed. Once he was settled, Martha turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Stay, just for a while." She hesitated, then pulled up a chair beside his bed. A silence settled. Between them, not entirely uncomfortable. "Tell me about yourself," he said unexpectedly, "beyond what's in your employment file." Martha raised an eyebrow. "You've read my file." "I make it a point to know who has access to my private life." His blue eyes studied her intently, but files only tell part of the story. She considered what to share. "I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My father left when I was young. My mother worked 2 jobs to support me and my sister, Kate. I was planning to go to college on a scholarship, but then my mom got sick, so I stayed to take care of her and help with Kate. Your file mentioned your mother passed away 3 years ago. I'm sorry." The genuine sympathy in his voice surprised her. "Thank you. After she was gone, I moved around a bit, taking whatever jobs I could find. My sister married young to a guy who turned out to be less than reliable. When he left her with a 5-year-old son, I started sending whatever money I could spare." "Is that why you took this job? The salary?" Martha nodded. "Jobs that pay this well don't come along often, for someone with my lack of qualifications." "Yet you're more competent than my Harvard-educated executives," he remarked. "Education isn't everything," says the man with 3 Ivy League degrees, she teased gently. He smiled again, a real smile that transformed his face. Touché. The next morning marked a shift in their relationship. The professional boundaries remained, but a new layer of understanding had been established. Ethan began to share more about his work, explaining complex business strategies as Martha helped him dress or organized his medication. She found herself fascinated by his brilliant mind, the way he could dissect problems and envision solutions beyond what others could see. One rainy afternoon, while organizing his desk, Martha came across a photograph she hadn't seen before: Ethan and Olivia on their wedding day, looking blissfully happy. "She was beautiful," Martha said when Ethan entered the room and found her looking at the picture. He took the frame from her hands, his expression unreadable. "She was everything." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." He placed the photograph face down on the desk. "It was a different lifetime. I was a different man then." "How did you meet?" Martha asked, unable to contain her curiosity. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sat heavily in his leather chair. Columbia University, sophomore year. She was studying art history. I was in computer science. We were complete opposites, yet somehow perfectly matched. His eyes took on a faraway look. "She believed in me before anyone else did. When I started my first company in our garage apartment, she supported us by teaching art to children. She never cared about the money, even when it started pouring in." Martha could hear the love in his voice, but also the pain. "She sounds remarkable." "She was the compass of my life," he said simply. "When she died, I lost my direction." The vulnerability in his admission touched something in Martha. "Is that why you closed the East Wing?" His jaw tightened. That was her space. Her studio was there, her garden room. It was filled with her laughter, her creativity. After she was gone, I couldn't bear to see it empty of her presence. "But you've reopened it now," Martha pointed out gently. Ethan's eyes met hers, intense and searching. Some ghosts need to be faced eventually. The conversation was interrupted by a call from his legal team, pulling him back into his role as CEO. Martha excused herself, but as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan Blackwood was slowly letting her see behind his carefully constructed facade. The following weeks brought a gradual improvement in Ethan's condition. The new medication seemed to be working, giving him more good days than bad. On one such day, he surprised Martha by asking her to accompany him to the East Wing. "Are you sure?" she asked, knowing how he had avoided it for years. He nodded, a determination in his eyes. "It's time." They walked in silence through the corridor leading to Olivia's studio. When Ethan pushed open the door, the room was exactly as Martha had cleaned it weeks earlier. An easel by the window, canvases stacked against walls, brushes still in jars, as if waiting for their owner's return. Ethan moved slowly through the space, running his fingers over Olivia's belongings. "She was working on a series about transformation," he said softly. "The beauty that emerges from pain." Martha remained quiet, sensing he needed to speak without interruption. "She never finished it," He stopped before an unfinished canvas showing a phoenix rising from ashes. The day before she died, she told me she was stuck, that something was missing from the composition. I was too busy with a product launch to really listen. The regret in his voice was palpable. Martha took a step closer. You couldn't have known. Couldn't I? His voice hardened. I was so absorbed in my empire that I missed the signs. She was trying to tell me something important, but I wasn't paying attention. What signs? Martha asked gently. Ethan turned to face her, his expression tormented. She wasn't just talking about her painting. She was trying to tell me about her health. She'd been experiencing symptoms for weeks but didn't want to worry me during the launch. By the time I realized and got her to a hospital, it was too late. The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. Martha could see now the source of his pain, not just grief, but guilt. It wasn't just the illness that took her from me, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It was my neglect, my obsession with success. I prioritized everything else above the one person who mattered most. Martha felt tears pricking at her eyes. Ethan, she said, using his first name for the first time, you can't blame yourself for what happened to Olivia. Can't I? He challenged, a storm brewing in his eyes. The doctors said if we'd caught it earlier, she might have had a chance. I was too blind to see what was happening right in front of me. That's a guilt I'll carry to my grave. As he spoke those words, a realization dawned on Martha. Ethan Blackwood's illness wasn't just attacking his body. He was allowing it to consume him, as if in penance for what he perceived as his greatest failure. Before she could respond, he swayed slightly, the emotional toll of the visit clearly taking a physical one as well. Martha moved quickly to support him, her arm around his waist. Let's get you back to your room, she said softly. As they made their slow way back through the corridor, Martha felt the weight of his confession settling around her. She was no longer just privy to his physical vulnerability, but to the wounds of his soul as well. The line between employer and caregiver was blurring into something more complex, more intimate. What had begun as a job was transforming into something neither of them had anticipated, a connection that transcended professional boundaries and ventured into dangerous territory. For Martha, the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Ethan Blackwood was no longer just the billionaire who signed her paychecks. He was becoming something far more complicated, a broken man she was beginning to care for deeply. Autumn descended on Greenwich, painting Westbrook Estate in hues of amber and crimson. The gardens Martha glimpsed from the windows transformed daily, leaves spiraling down in elegant surrender to the changing season. Inside the mansion's walls, another transformation was taking place, one less visible but equally profound. Ethan's health continued to improve under the new treatment regimen. The tremors were less frequent, his strength gradually returning. With this physical revival came a different kind of awakening. He began venturing outside his suite more often, sometimes accompanying Martha on her daily walk through the gardens, their conversations extending beyond business matters to literature, philosophy, and art, subjects Olivia had loved. On one such afternoon, they paused by a stone bench overlooking a small lake on the property. The water reflected the fiery foliage, creating a mirror world of autumn glory. Olivia designed this landscape, Ethan said, breaking a comfortable silence. The architects wanted something more formal, but she insisted on this wild, natural approach. She said manicured gardens were like people wearing masks, impressive but hiding their true nature. Martha smiled, picturing the woman from the photographs making such a declaration. She sounds like she was quite a force. Unstoppable when she believed in something. Ethan's voice carried equal measures of pride and loss. Including me. He sat on the bench, his breathing slightly labored from the walk. Martha joined him, maintaining a respectful distance. You never talk about how you got started, she observed. The magazines paint you as an overnight success story, but I'm guessing the reality was more complicated. Ethan gave a short laugh. The overnight part took about 10 years of sleeping on futons and eating ramen noodles. His expression softened with nostalgia. Olivia and I were just kids, really, 24, married less than a year. I had this idea for a security algorithm. that no one in Silicon Valley would back. Too risky, they said. But you proved them wrong. Eventually, after dozens of rejections and near bankruptcy twice, he turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the autumn colors around them. Olivia never doubted. Not once. Even when we had to sell her car to make rent, she just said it gave her an excuse to walk more. Martha could feel the weight of his gratitude across the years. She believed in your vision. More than that, she believed in me when I stopped. Believing in myself. He picked up a fallen leaf, turning it absently between his fingers. The night I finally sold the algorithm to Meridian Tech, I promised her I'd never forget what she sacrificed for us. That no matter how successful we became, I'd always prioritize what mattered most, our relationship. His voice caught on the last word. I broke that promise, Martha. Gradually, then completely. Success has a way of consuming you from the inside out. Before I knew it, I was working 18-hour days, missing anniversaries, postponing vacations. And Olivia, she never complained, not once. She understood what you were building, Martha suggested gently. Ethan shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. What I was building was a monument to my own ego. Blackwood Technologies could have succeeded without me working myself to death and driving everyone else to do the same. But I couldn't see that until it was too late. A chill breeze swept across the lake, causing Martha to wrap her cardigan tighter around herself. Ethan noticed and instinctively moved, closer, offering his warmth. We should head back, she said, suddenly aware of their proximity. He nodded but made no move to rise. There's something I need to tell you, something I've never told anyone. Martha felt a flutter of apprehension. You don't have to. I do, he interrupted, because you've seen me at my weakest and somehow you still look at me like I'm worthy of respect. Because you've helped me face Olivia's memory after 5 years of running from it, because I'm tired of carrying this alone. The intensity in his eyes made Martha's heart race. She nodded silently, giving him permission to continue. The night Olivia died, he began, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I was supposed to be with her. We had plans, a rare evening together. I promised her I wouldn't cancel this time. But then the Berlin deal started falling apart and he broke off, visibly struggling with the memory. You had to work, Martha finished for him. I chose to work, he corrected harshly. There's a difference. I could have delegated, could have kept my promise. Instead, I called and cancelled our plans. Again, she didn't even sound surprised. His face contorted with pain. The last thing she said to me was, It's okay, Ethan, I understand. Martha reached out instinctively, placing her hand over his. You couldn't have known what would happen. That's just it, he continued, turning his hand to clasp hers. If I'd been there, I would have noticed when she collapsed. I would have called an ambulance immediately. Instead, she was alone in that big, empty house for hours before our housekeeper found her. The anguish in his voice cut through Martha like a physical pain. The aneurysm could have happened anywhere, any time, even if you'd been there. The doctors said time was critical. Those hours she spent unconscious on the floor. His voice broke. By the time they got her to the hospital, it was too late for anything but saying goodbye. I didn't even make it back from Berlin in time for that. Martha felt tears welling in her eyes. Oh, Ethan, do you know what's worse than the guilt, he asked, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The fact that it changed nothing. I threw myself even deeper into work afterward, as if building a bigger empire could somehow fill the void she left. I became harder, colder, the kind of CEO business schools glorify and normal people despise. Until you got sick, Martha said, softly. He let out a bitter laugh. Poetic justice, isn't it? The workaholic felled by his own stress-induced illness. The doctors can't even agree on a diagnosis. Some complicated autoimmune response triggered by chronic stress and grief. They say. Martha considered his words carefully before responding. Maybe it's not punishment, Ethan. Maybe it's an opportunity. He looked at her quizzically. For what? To realign with the person you were when Olivia fell in love with you. To remember what matters before it's too late. Something shifted in his expression. a softening around the eyes, a vulnerability that made him look younger. "And what does matter, Martha Wheeler?" She met his gaze steadily. "Connection, purpose, living. A life that honors what Olivia saw in you, not just professional success, but the goodness beneath it." The intensity between them crescendoed in the autumn stillness. Martha became acutely aware of their hands still joined, of the diminishing space between them on the bench. When Ethan leaned forward, she knew what was about to happen, but found herself unable or unwilling to stop it. His lips met hers with gentle pressure, a question more than a demand. For one breathless moment, Martha allowed herself to respond, to feel the connection that had been building between them for weeks. Then, reality crashed in like a wave. She pulled back abruptly, standing from the bench. "I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. We can't." Ethan remained seated, looking equally shocked by what had transpired. "Martha, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have It's not appropriate," she cut him off, straightening her cardigan with trembling hands. "I work for you. You're vulnerable right now. This isn't real." A flash of hurt crossed his features. "Isn't it?" "No," she insisted, though the lie tasted bitter. "You're confusing gratitude with something else, and I'm confusing compassion with and I don't know what." "I think we both know exactly what this is," Ethan said quietly, rising to stand before her. "And it terrifies us both." Martha took a step back. "I should give my notice. This situation has become—" "Please don't." The request was soft but urgent. "I need you here, Martha. Not just as my assistant or caretaker, as the one person who sees me, truly sees me." "That's exactly the problem," she whispered. "I see you too clearly and you see me, and it's changing things that shouldn't change." A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and emotions too complex to name. Finally, Ethan nodded. "I won't cross that line again," he promised. "But please don't leave. Not yet." Something in his voice, a note of genuine fear, made Martha hesitate. Despite her better judgment, she found herself nodding. "All right, but we need clearer boundaries." "Agreed," he said, relief evident in his expression. They walked back to the house in silence, the brief moment of intimacy already fading like the autumn day around them, yet leaving its imprint on both their hearts. The following week brought an unexpected development that further complicated their delicate situation. Lawrence Thornton, Ethan's longtime business partner and friend, arrived unannounced at Westbrook Estate. "I had to see for myself," Lawrence declared as he strode into Ethan's study, where Martha was helping him review quarterly reports. 3 months of you working remotely, cancelling board appearances and sending your assistant to key meetings in your place. The rumors are flying, Ethan." Lawrence cast a suspicious glance at Martha, who immediately began gathering her papers to leave. "Stay," Ethan commanded softly, then turned to his friend. "Lawrence, this is Martha Wheeler, my personal assistant. Martha, Lawrence Thornton, Blackwood Technologies' CFO and professional warrior." Lawrence didn't crack a smile at the introduction. "We need to talk privately, Ethan. Anything you have to say can be said in front of Martha. She has my complete trust." The declaration sent a warm current through Martha, even as she recognized the complications it represented. Lawrence's expression darkened. "Fine. The board is getting restless. Your absence is creating instability. Meridian Tech is circling with a hostile takeover bid, and our stock has dropped 12% in 2 months. We need you back in New York, visibly at the helm." Ethan remained calm. "The company is performing exceptionally well under the current arrangement. The quarterly numbers—" "It's not about the numbers," Lawrence interrupted. "It's about perception, leadership, confidence. Things are happening that you should know about. Whispers of internal sabotage, potential leaks of proprietary information." Ethan leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of leaks?" Lawrence glanced again at Martha. Despite Ethan's assurances, he clearly wasn't comfortable speaking freely in her presence. "It's related to Project Phoenix," he said cryptically. Martha watched as Ethan's expression changed subtly. "Martha, could you give us a moment after all?" She nodded, gathering her materials and exiting the study. As she closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but wonder about Project Phoenix and why its mere mention had caused such tension. Later that evening, Martha brought Ethan his evening medication to find him standing at the window of his bedroom, gazing out at the moonlit grounds, his posture rigid with stress. "Lawrence left?" she asked, setting down the tray with his pills and water. "Back to New York," Ethan confirmed, without turning. "He's not happy with me." Martha approached cautiously. "The company is in trouble?" "Not in the way he thinks." Ethan finally turned to face her, his expression troubled. "Project Phoenix isn't a product or service. It's an internal investigation. I launched 6 months ago before my condition worsened." "Investigation into what?" He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Into Olivia's medical records. Inconsistencies I found after her passing that never made sense." Martha felt a chill. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Her autopsy showed traces of a medication she wasn't prescribed, one that could have exacerbated. Her condition accelerated the rupture of the aneurysm." His voice was controlled, but Martha could hear the undercurrent of pain. "For years I told myself it was a hospital error, a mix-up in her treatment during those final hours." "But you don't believe that anymore," Martha said softly, beginning to understand. Ethan shook his head. "I hired private investigators, had them discreetly review everything. The medication was in her system before she arrived at the hospital." The implication hung heavy in the air. Martha struggled to process what he was suggesting. "Are you saying someone deliberately gave her something harmful?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Maybe she took it herself, not knowing the interaction risk. Maybe someone at the house gave it to her thinking it would help her headaches. Or maybe it wasn't accidental at all." Martha finished the thought he couldn't bring himself to voice. Their eyes met in shared understanding of the gravity of such a possibility. "Who would want to harm Olivia?" Martha asked. Ethan's expression hardened. At the time, Blackwood Technologies was on the verge of releasing a quantum encryption system that would have revolutionized cybersecurity. There were powerful interests who didn't want that technology on the market. Competitors, foreign entities, even certain government factions. "And they would target your wife to stop you?" Martha couldn't keep the horror from her voice. "It sounds paranoid, I know. But in this industry, especially at the intersection of national security and private enterprise," he trailed off, then continued more softly. "Or maybe I'm looking for conspiracy where there was only tragedy, a way to displace my guilt onto external forces." Martha stepped closer, her professional boundaries momentarily forgotten. "Is this why you reopened the East Wing? To look for answers?" He nodded. "I've been going through her things, her journals, looking for any clue about what might have happened that day, who she spoke to, who visited the house. And now information about Project Phoenix is leaking," Martha said, connecting the dots, "which means someone knows you're investigating." "Exactly." Ethan's blue eyes fixed on hers intensely. "Which is why Lawrence wants me back in New York, to contain the situation before it spirals. But I can't leave now, not when I'm finally making progress." Martha hesitated before asking her next question. "What have you found?" Ethan moved to his desk and withdrew a small leather-bound book from a locked drawer. Olivia's last journal. She wrote almost every day. He opened it carefully, turning to a marked page. 3 days before she died, she wrote about a visitor, someone from my past who'd recently reappeared in our lives. He handed Martha the journal, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The entry was brief but revealing. April 12th Ease. Old friend V came by again today while E was in Berlin. Something about his sudden reappearance after all these years doesn't feel right. He asked so many questions about E's work, especially the quantum project. Said he was just catching up, but his interest felt calculated. I didn't tell E about the visit. He's under enough pressure with the Berlin negotiations. But I'm going to do some digging of my own. If V has ulterior motives, E needs to know before the project launch. Martha looked up from the page. V? Victor Devlin, Ethan supplied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. My college roommate before I met Olivia. We started our first company together, but it fell apart when he wanted to sell our early encryption work to questionable overseas buyers. I bought him out, and we hadn't spoken for nearly a decade. Until he suddenly reappeared just before Olivia's passing, Martha observed, a chill running through her. Ethan nodded grimly. According to the household staff records from that time, he visited 3 times in the week before she died. The last visit was the morning of her collapse. Beyond implication hung between them like a physical presence. Martha carefully closed the journal, her mind racing with this new information. Have you confronted him? I can't find him, Ethan admitted. After Olivia's death, he vanished again, but 6 months ago, his name appeared on the board of directors at Meridian Tech, the same company now attempting a hostile takeover of Blackwood Technologies. Martha inhaled sharply. That can't be coincidence. No, Ethan agreed, which is why Lawrence is so concerned. If Meridian succeeds in the takeover, they get access to everything, including all our quantum encryption research, the very technology Victor tried to sell years ago. Have you gone to the authorities? Martha asked. Ethan's expression turned bitter. With what? A cryptic journal entry and business coincidences? I need proof, Martha. Real proof before I can make accusations of this magnitude. Martha studied his face, the lines of exhaustion, the shadows of grief, but also the burning determination. She realized that his illness, while real, had become secondary to this quest for truth about Olivia's passing. Let me help you, she said quietly, surprising herself with the offer. Ethan looked equally surprised. This isn't your battle, Martha. It could be dangerous if Victor or Meridian realize you're involved. I'm already involved, she pointed out, and I have access to areas of the house, staff relationships you don't. I could find things you might miss. The concern in his eyes touched her deeply. Why would you risk that for me? Martha considered her answer carefully, aware they were stepping into territory far beyond employer and employee. Because I believe everyone deserves to know the truth about the people they've lost, and because, she hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty, because I care what happens to you, Ethan. The admission hung between them, simple yet profound. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. Martha, he began, his voice low and intense, if you do this, there's no going back to the way things were. You'll be part of something that could have serious consequences. I know, she replied steadily. But sometimes doing the right thing means crossing lines you never thought you would. In that moment, with the moonlight streaming through the windows and Olivia's journal between them, Martha felt a shift in their relationship, a deepening connection forged in shared purpose and growing trust. The boundaries she had insisted upon just days ago seemed less definitive now, blurred by the weight of what they had just discovered. As they stood together, planning their next steps in unraveling the mystery surrounding Olivia's final days, Martha couldn't ignore the voice in her head, warning her that she was becoming emotionally entangled in ways that went far beyond professional concern. Yet another voice, equally insistent, told her that some connections transcended conventional boundaries, that what was growing between her and Ethan was as inevitable as the changing seasons outside Westbrook's windows. What had begun as a simple job had evolved into a complex web of emotion, mystery, and potential danger. And Martha Wheeler, who had always lived a cautious, practical life, now found herself at the center of a story far bigger than she ever could have imagined, one that would test not only her courage, but her heart as well. The weeks that followed transformed Westbrook Estate from a sanctuary of convalescence into a hub of covert investigation. Martha and Ethan established a careful routine. By day, maintaining appearances of employer and assistant. By night, piecing together the puzzle of Olivia's final days. Martha's role proved invaluable. Her connections with the staff yielded information Ethan could never have accessed. Rosa, the housekeeper who had worked at Westbrook during Olivia's time, remembered Victor Devlin's visits vividly. There was something about him that made Mrs. Blackwood uncomfortable, Rosa confided to Martha as they folded linens one afternoon. She was always so welcoming to Mr. Blackwood's associates, but with Mr. Devlin she was different, guarded. "Did you ever overhear any of their conversations?" Martha asked casually. Rosa hesitated. "It wasn't my place to listen, but the last time he visited their voices were raised. Mrs. Blackwood told him to leave, that she knew what he was trying to do. He said something about her not understanding the bigger picture." She lowered her voice further. "Later that day, I brought her tea. She seemed distraught, making phone calls in her studio. When I entered, she quickly hung up and closed her laptop." This information sent Martha and Ethan searching for Olivia's old laptop, which they eventually found stored in a forgotten cabinet in her studio. The device was password protected, but Ethan, drawing on intimate knowledge of his wife's habits, managed to gain access after several attempts. The emails and documents they discovered painted a disturbing picture. In the days before her collapse, Olivia had been conducting her own investigation into Victor Devlin, uncovering connections between him and foreign technology firms with questionable ethics. Her final email, never sent, was addressed to Ethan himself. "Ethan, I need to speak with you urgently. What Victor is involved in goes beyond industrial espionage. I've gathered evidence that he's working with Meridian to sabotage the quantum project launch. Please call me as soon as you get this, no matter the time. I love you." Dated the day of her collapse, the email had remained in her drafts folder, never reaching its intended recipient. "She knew," Ethan whispered, his face ashen as they sat side by side in Olivia's studio, the laptop between them. "She was trying to warn me." The discovery only deepened the mystery. If Victor had indeed visited that morning, what had transpired between them? Could he have somehow administered the medication found in Olivia's system? Late one evening, as Martha was organizing the digital evidence they'd gathered, she noticed something. A folder in Olivia's cloud storage labeled simply "Insurance." Inside was a video file dated the morning of her collapse. "Ethan," she called, her heart racing, "I think you need to see this." He joined her at the desk, his shoulder pressing against hers as they leaned toward the screen. Martha clicked play, and Olivia's face filled the display, beautiful, determined, and very much alive. The sight made Ethan inhale sharply beside her. "If you're watching this," Olivia began, her voice steady despite the worry evident in her eyes, "then something has happened to me, and I need you to know the truth. Victor Devlin isn't who you think he is, Ethan. He's been working with Meridian Tech to steal the quantum encryption technology. When that failed, they developed a more aggressive approach." She looked directly into the camera, as if staring across time into Ethan's eyes. "He came to the house this morning with an ultimatum. Either you sell the technology to Meridian at a fraction of its worth, or they'll destroy everything you've built. When I threatened to expose him, She paused, visibly shaken. "He implied that accidents happen all the time, that no security system can protect against every threat." Martha felt Ethan tense beside her, his breathing becoming shallow. "I'm going to the police with what I know," Olivia continued. "But first, I'm sending you all the evidence I've gathered. It's in this folder. Financial transactions linking Victor to offshore accounts, communications with Meridian executives, everything you'll need to stop them." She leaned closer to the camera, her expression softening. "Ethan, if anything happens to me, please don't lose yourself in grief or guilt. What we built together goes beyond business empires. It's about creating something meaningful, something that helps people. Don't let them take that from you too." Her final words were spoken with such tenderness that Martha felt tears welling in her eyes. "I love you more than anything. Remember that. Always." The video ended, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Martha turned to Ethan, whose face had gone completely white, his eyes fixed on the frozen image of his wife. "She never made it to the police," he said finally, his voice hollow. "The aneurysm, or what we thought was just an aneurysm, happened hours after this recording. Martha's mind raced with the implications. The medication in her system, Desnu, could have been administered during Victor's visit, Ethan finished, a dangerous edge entering his voice. Something to trigger the aneurysm or accelerate its rupture. Something that would look natural, especially in someone with her family. History of cerebrovascular issues. He stood abruptly, pacing the room with renewed energy. We have him, Martha. With this video and the evidence Olivia collected, we can prove Victor's involvement in corporate espionage at minimum. And if we can link him to the medication found in her system, it would mean proving he was responsible for her passing, Martha said quietly, watching Ethan's transformation from grief-stricken widow to avenging husband with a mixture of concern and admiration. I need to take this to Lawrence and the board immediately, Ethan declared, and to the FBI. This goes beyond corporate rivalry. It's about justice for Olivia. Martha stood as well, placing a steadying hand on his arm. Ethan, we need to be careful. If Victor realizes we have this evidence before the authorities are involved. I've been careful for 5 years, he interrupted, covering her hand with his own. I've been careful while they've been planning to dismantle everything Olivia and I built. No more. The determination in his eyes was matched only by the intensity of his grip on her hand. Martha recognized the transformation happening before. Her Ethan Blackwood was reclaiming not just his company, but his purpose. Then let me help you do this right, she said firmly. We organize everything tonight. Contact your attorneys first thing in the morning, then the FBI. We move decisively but strategically. Something in her practical approach seemed to center him. He nodded, his breathing steadier. You're right. As always. They worked through the night, organizing Olivia's evidence, cross-referencing it with financial records from Blackwood Technologies, and preparing a comprehensive case against Victor Devlin and his collaborators at Meridian Tech. As dawn broke, over Westbrook Estate, they had assembled an irrefutable narrative of corporate espionage, betrayal, and potentially something far more sinister. Ethan made the necessary calls at first light, setting in motion a chain of events that would soon rock the corporate world. By midday, his attorneys had arrived at Westbrook, followed hours later by federal agents who listened with increasing interest to the evidence presented. Martha watched from the periphery as Ethan commanded the room, articulate, focused, and exuding an authority that had been dormant during his months of illness. This was the business titan the world knew, yet tempered now with a humanity and purpose that transcended mere corporate success. When the officials finally departed, taking with them copies of all the evidence, Ethan found Martha in the garden, seated on the same bench where they had shared their first meaningful conversation weeks earlier. It's done, he said, settling beside her with a weariness that spoke of emotional rather than physical exhaustion. The FBI is moving against Victor. Tonight, Meridian stock is already plummeting on rumors of federal investigation. Martha studied, his face in the fading light. How do you feel? It was a simple question, but one that seemed to catch him off guard. He considered it seriously before responding. Vindicated, relieved, angry that it took so long. He paused, turning to meet her gaze. But mostly I feel like I can finally breathe again, like I've been holding my breath for 5 years without realizing it. Olivia would be proud, Martha said softly. You didn't just protect the company, you stood up for what was, right even when it meant facing painful truths. Ethan nodded, emotion crossing his features. I kept thinking about what she said in that video, about creating something meaningful. For years after she was gone, I lost sight of that. I was just accumulating power and wealth without purpose. And now, Martha prompted gently, now I want to rebuild Blackwood Technologies with that mission at its core. Use the quantum encryption technology, not just for profit, but for protecting vulnerable systems, hospitals, public infrastructure, humanitarian organizations. His eyes lit with a passion Martha hadn't seen before. That would be a legacy worthy of Olivia. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees around them, carrying the scent of earth and change. Martha felt a complex swirl of emotions, pride in what they had accomplished together, admiration for Ethan's transformation, and an undeniable sadness at what would inevitably come next. "You'll be returning to New York," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Yes," he confirmed. There's much to do. Legal proceedings against Victor and his associates, restructuring the company, implementing the new vision." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I'd like you to come with me." Martha's heart stuttered in her chest. "To New York. As my executive assistant," he clarified, then added with a hint of uncertainty, "for now." The implication of those two words hung between them, a suggestion of possibility, of evolution beyond professional boundaries when the time was right. "Ethan," Martha began carefully, "these past months have been extraordinary. What we've discovered together." She took a steadying breath. "But I need to be certain that what you're feeling, what we're both feeling, isn't just a product of these intense circumstances." He considered her words thoughtfully. "You think once I'm back in my normal life, surrounded by power and privilege again, I'll revert to the man I was before?" "Not exactly," she replied. "But trauma, illness, shared purpose, they create powerful bonds that can feel like something else. And you're still healing from losing Olivia, from learning the truth about her passing." Ethan's gaze remained steady on hers. "You're worried I'm transferring my feelings for her onto you." "Maybe," Martha admitted, "or that I've become a symbol of redemption rather than a person in my own right." To her surprise, he smiled, a genuine warm expression that transformed his features. "Martha Wheeler, from the moment you walked into my study and didn't flinch at my rudeness, you have never been a symbol of anything except yourself. Your honesty, your practical compassion, your unwavering moral compass, these are uniquely you." He took her hand carefully, as if it was something precious. "I won't pretend I'm not still grieving Olivia. I probably always will be in some way. But what I feel for you isn't a replacement or a transference. It's entirely new, unexpected, and real." Martha felt tears threatening at his words. "Even so, we both need time. You have a company to rebuild, a legal battle ahead. I have family responsibilities, a life that's been on hold. Then perhaps we both need space to find our true paths," he suggested, though she could see it cost him to say it. "And if those paths converge again, then it will be because we've chosen it freely," Martha finished, squeezing his hand. "Not because of extraordinary circumstances that pushed us together." Understanding passed between them, a recognition that sometimes the bravest choice was patience rather than immediate pursuit. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. News broke of Victor Devlin's arrest on charges of corporate espionage, with investigations ongoing regarding Olivia Blackwood's untimely passing. Ethan made a triumphant return to Blackwood Technologies headquarters, announcing a new direction for the company focused on ethical applications of their security technology. On Martha's final morning at Westbrook Estate, she found Ethan in Olivia's studio. He was carefully wrapping her unfinished paintings, preparing them for transport. "You're taking them to New York?" Martha asked from the doorway. He nodded. "I'm establishing an art foundation in her name. These will be displayed along with completed works from her collection. She always wanted to support emerging artists who use their talent for social commentary." Martha smiled, recognizing this gesture as part of his healing process, honoring Olivia's memory while moving forward with his own life. "That's a beautiful tribute." Ethan set down the painting he was wrapping and approached her. "I have something for you," he said, withdrawing a small envelope from his pocket. Martha accepted it curiously. Inside was a check with an amount that made her gasp. "Ethan, I can't accept this. It's far beyond a reasonable severance." "It's not severance," he corrected gently. "It's investment capital. You mentioned once that your sister wanted to open a small catering business, but lacked the startup funds. This should be enough to make that happen, and to help with your nephew's education fund." Martha stared at him, speechless with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it. Say you'll give Kate and her son the stability they deserve." His expression grew earnest. "And say you'll stay in touch. Not as my employee, but as someone who matters deeply to me." Martha nodded. unable to voice her agreement past the lump in her throat. Instead, she stepped forward and embraced him, their first true embrace, free from the constraints of their former roles. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, "for everything." When they pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes, but also a sense of rightness about the path ahead. "I should go," Martha said. "My train leaves in an hour." Ethan walked her to the entrance of Westbrook Estate, where a car waited to take her to the station. Before she got in, he took both her hands in his. "Martha Wheeler, you came into my life when I was at my lowest point, physically weak, emotionally lost, and spiritually broken. You helped me find more than just the truth about Olivia. You helped me rediscover my own humanity." She smiled through her tears. "And you showed me that sometimes the most important journeys aren't the ones that take us to new places, but the ones that take us deeper into understanding who we truly are." So their goodbye wasn't filled with promises or declarations. It didn't need to be. What existed between them transcended conventional romance. It was a connection forged in shared purpose, mutual respect, and the kind of understanding that comes only from witnessing another person's most vulnerable moments. As the car pulled away from Westbrook Estate, Martha looked back at the mansion that had changed her life so profoundly. Ethan stood framed in the entrance, a solitary figure against the grandeur of his home. But unlike the lonely billionaire she had first encountered, he now stood straight and purposeful. A man recommitted to living a life of meaning. 6 months later, Martha sat in her modest apartment in Columbus, Ohio, reviewing the business plan for her sister's now thriving catering company. The evening news played softly in the background until a familiar name caught her attention. Blackwood Technologies announced today a groundbreaking initiative to provide quantum encryption services free of charge to hospitals and humanitarian organizations worldwide. CEO Ethan Blackwood, who recently testified in the ongoing trial against former business associate Victor Devlin, stated that the initiative honors the legacy of his late wife, Olivia Blackwood, whose foundation continues to support artists addressing social issues through their work. Martha smiled as Ethan appeared on screen, looking healthy and engaged as he described the initiative to reporters. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by the clear gaze of a man who had found his purpose again. Her phone chimed with a message. She glanced down to see Ethan's name on the screen, their first communication in months. "The Quantum Initiative launched today. Thought you might want to know that your pep talk on a certain garden bench ultimately led to protecting vulnerable systems in 27 countries. The board thinks I've lost my mind, giving away our most valuable technology. But for the first time in years, I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. How about you?" Martha felt warmth spread through her as she typed her reply. "My sister's business is thriving. My nephew made honor roll, and I've just been offered a position managing a community outreach program for a local foundation. Different scale from Blackwood Technologies, but the same principle, creating something meaningful. I'm exactly where I need to be. For now." She hesitated, then added, "P.S. Tell the board that the truly valuable things in life are never diminished by being shared." His response came seconds later. That sounds exactly like something Olivia would have said, and something Martha Wheeler would put into practice. Two extraordinary women who changed one ordinary man for the better. P.S. For now leaves room for paths to converge when the time is right. I'm counting on it. Martha set down her phone, a quiet contentment settling over her. The journey that had begun with a simple job application had transformed not just Ethan's life, but her own. She had entered Westbrook Estate as a housekeeper and emerged as a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest acts of service aren't about cleaning spaces, but helping to heal souls, including her own. Outside her window, autumn leaves drifted down in the early evening light, reminding her of conversations on a stone bench beside a lake. Whether her path would one day lead back to Ethan Blackwood remained to be seen. But for now, she was grateful for the journey they had shared, a journey of truth, healing, and the quiet power of human connection that transcends wealth, status, and circumstance. In the end, they had given each other the most valuable gift possible, the courage to move forward, carrying the lessons of the past without being defined by them. And in a world often driven by power and possession, perhaps that was the greatest fortune of all. Ta film da historia. Dear listeners, we hope Martha and Ethan's journey at Westbrook Estate has touched your heart. Their story reminds us that true healing often comes through unexpected connections, and that even our darkest moments can lead to profound transformation. If you enjoyed this emotional exploration of redemption, forgiveness, and second chances, we've prepared a special playlist of equally compelling stories that examine the complexity of human relationships. You'll find it by clicking on the link to your left. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up if Martha and Ethan's story resonated with you. Every day we bring you unique narratives that delve into life's most meaningful questions and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. What path do you think Martha and Ethan's relationship will take in the future? Will their separate journeys eventually lead back to each other? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Until our next story, remember that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't found in mansions or corporate empires, but in the connections we forge when we're brave enough to be truly seen.